Howard Adelman is a scholar who has taught at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, at Smith College here in Massachusetts, as well as at institutions in Israel, Germany, and Australia. Many years ago, Howie Adelman wrote a dissertation on Leon Modena, a 17th century Venetian rabbi, cantor, poet, choral director, and expediter in the publication of Hebrew books, including Salamone Rossi's Hashirim Asher Lishlomo. The decision to compose, perform, and publish Hebrew art music, choral music for the synagogue, was highly controversial in his day, the reason for which we will discuss here. Howie's research continues to focus on Rabbi Modena and the brilliant intellectual and social context of 17th century northern Italy. He has also written about Jewish women in early modern Italy, including the book Women and Jewish Marriage Negotiations in Early Modern Italy for Love and Money. So let's talk about Leon Modena, who was a friend of Salamone Rossi. They were probably the same age, and Modena is the one who encouraged Rossi to write this music and to publish it, but he was a very colorful figure in his own right. So, Howie, tell us about the incredible life and career of Modena.
You mentioned that they were friends, and that Modena encouraged Rossi to publish his music.
In the preface to Rossi's collection, Rabbi Modena wrote, Gam Anochi. I also, from the time I counted myself one of his friends, I really begged him and pleaded with him until we were successful, thanks to the Creator of all, and he reached that point I had hoped he would for us here. He came and consented to fulfill his vow and publish as he had promised. Ba v'hiskim l'shalem nidro lehadpis bidvar hanidor.
In terms of traces of friendship, I haven't seen all that much. All I see is the paper trail at the beginning of Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, which has many of the customary bloated introductory materials of Hebrew books, of Latin books. The Latinists are worse than the Hebraists when it comes to bloated introductions. And I see that there are many contacts that they had between mutual contacts, but what the actual relationship is, I'm not sure.
Who were some of these contacts that they had in common?
Basically, the thread that I've been following is the incogniti, the Academia de Incogniti, groups of most writers call them salons, but they were much more intense than that. They were music, literary, intellectual circles that were throughout northern Italy and farther afield at this time.
These were just Jews or everybody? Or?
It was mainly not Jews.
Okay.
It was not Jews. But Modena had demonstrable connections with many members of the Incogniti. And there are other people whose connections can be traced. The most interesting, I think, is Moshe Sulam, who sponsored the publication of Shirim. And he was related to Modena's buddy Sarah Copia Sulam in Venice, and she also had a what's called a salon, but it may actually been more of a catchment for members of the academy in Venice at this time.
And that would be
So
the non-Jews still?
almost all the people that gathered were non-Jews, and what this shows with modernist contacts and with Sarah Copia Sulam's contacts is that it's a very porous boundary between Jews and Christians at this time, and certainly in the cultural area. There were one or two Jews who were actually members of these academies, but there were lots of Jews who had multiple associations with people in the academies.
You know, it sounds like almost the salons that were created by the Jewish women in Germany and Austria in the late 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, I think a lot of historians have delighted in that similarity because there's a certain mystique of Rachel Varnhagen and company, Dorothea Mendelssohn. But it seems to me that they might not be that radically different. Both the academies and the salons were gathering places of people of the highest ranks of politics, of culture, of the military, of the clergy.
Let's go back. I mean, let's go back now to the 17th century. Academy, all right? Did not Leon Modena establish a musical academy himself, and specifically for Jews, in Venice?
Well, in 1628, there was a wave of refugees from Mantua that brought a lot of accomplished musicians his way. But by 1630, when the plague hit, it was decimated, literally. As the academy struggled, one of the interesting points that shows up in the slim correspondence about it is that there was an attempt to join forces with a Christian academy of musicians. And the discussions that Giulio Morosini, in his very bloated discussion of Judaism, describes several events of the academy.
Giulio Morosini had been a student of Modena's and later converted to Christianity. He wrote about Modena's academy in his Via della Fede, published in 1683. I remember well what happened during my time in Venice around 1628. It was around then, if I am not mistaken, when the Jews fled Mantua because of the war and came to Venice. Since the city of Mantua flourished in all sorts of studies, the Jews also applied themselves to music and to musical instruments. Those who arrived in Venice founded an academy of music in the ghetto, where they sang twice per week in the evening, and only the most important and wealthy congregants of the ghetto attended and sustained it, of which I myself was one. My master, Rabbi Leon Modena, was the maestro di cappella.
It was serious business. I mean, they needed police officers to control the crowds.
In that year, two rich and splendid persons, one of whom was a member of the same academy, had already been designated as sposi for this festival held at the Spanish synagogue, richly decorated and adorned with silver and great jewels. As per our custom, the musicians organized themselves into two choirs, and on the 2 evenings, beginning on the 8th day of Shemini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, they sang figured music in the Hebrew language, parts of the Arvit service and several psalms, as well as the Mincha service, that is, the Vespers of the last day, with solemn music which lasted several hours into the night. Many noblemen and ladies gathered, offering great applause, so that it was necessary to guard the door with many captains and policemen so that things might pass calmly. Among the instruments, the organ was also brought to the synagogue, although it was not permitted by the rabbis, as it is an instrument that is normally played in our churches. But what of it? All of this was just a flash in the pan. The academy lasted only a short time, and music returned to its former practices.
It was somewhere.
They were making music, not just talking about it, but these were musicians coming together, right?
These were musicians, yes, and they also had composers producing the material. Another discussion that follows through the literature is to what extent was Modena himself a composer, or what extent was he just the maestro de capella in this operation? To what extent did he conduct? All of these roles are very fuzzy, and a lot of the literature is written in the subjunctive.
So Modena was a prodigy and a polymath, if we are to believe that everything he wrote about himself. He had so many different occupations. You want to talk about that?
First of all, I don't think it's a matter of him writing about himself. I think that he left a significant, not only did he leave a significant paper trail, but there is a significant paper trail by others about him.
In addition to his autobiography, you're saying?
Oh, his autobiography, everything in it can be multiplied extensively by what others have written about him and the materials that he's left behind. So that it's not a matter, in fact, his autobiography diminishes most of his accomplishments. It deals more with his sense of failure rather than his accomplishments. He elaborates on his depression, his inability to find an apartment, his difficult marriage, his trouble with his children. That seems to predominate. The only thing he boasts about in the autobiography is how well his sermons were received. And he does provide a listing of significant amounts of what he wrote prefaces to, poetries and songs that he wrote. But there's much more out there in various manuscripts, libraries, and archives, so that there's no doubt that he's a polymath. He's absolutely brilliant. His Hebrew is exquisite. I don't have the skills to judge his musical talents, but they're certainly on exhibit. He was cantor at the Italian synagogue in the ghetto for 50 years.
Of Venice or Mantua?
Of Venice. Leon Modena, almost his entire life was in Venice. He had a few excursions to Ferrara, and to Florence, where he held positions. The famous case of the choral music that he was first involved in was when he was doing a 3-year gig in Ferrara.
She'elah. The question. We have with us 6 or 8 men, educated in the art of song, which the Italians call music, men of our congregation. May their rock keep them in life. Men who on holidays and festivals joyfully raise their voices in the synagogue, singing songs and hymns of praise, such as En Kelohenu, Aleinu L'Shabeach, Yigdal, Adon Olam, and the like, to the glory of the Lord with polyphonic voices, in this art of harmony. But a man got up to drive them out with his speech, saying that it is not proper to do this, for in this man's opinion, joyous song and praises set to artful music have been forbidden since the temple was destroyed, as witness the words of the prophet Hosea, "Rejoice not, O Israel, in gladness like the other nations." Even though most of the singers are learned in the Torah, this man ridiculed them in front of all the people who heard their voices. Therefore, let the Torah teachers issue an official halachic ruling deciding whether this practice is prohibited or whether it is indeed a sweet sound with which to praise the Lord. Kol arev lemino lahalel ya. So do you think that was music by Rossi that was sung in Ferrara before it was published, or Modena wrote it, or were there other composers that were doing this other than Rossi?
That's a great question, because it really cuts through a lot of the fog that's out there in terms of what's known not only about Rossi and Modena, but about Jewish music in general. As I said, much of what's written is in the subjunctive. Coulda, would've, maybe, probablys, and even Don Haran, who has written of blessed memory, who has written copiously on Rossi and Saracopia Sulam, he sometimes get carried away in the subjunctive, but he once wrote an article, I think it was in the Zamir journal, about how you can only write about this material in the subjunctive using probablys and maybes and could'ves. But there is a serious question that I think is crucial for the history of Jewish music, for the history of Jewish culture, even for the history of Jewish social interactions, and that is the trajectory of Jewish music. When I read history and I see the word first, I reach for my pistol, because as soon as someone tries to label something as first, it sends off alarm bells that how do they know it's first?
All right, so Rossi himself writes, unless it was written by a ghost written by Modena, on the front page he says hadash or hadasha ba'aretz. He said he was the first, and elsewhere it said that he was the first to write music for the synagogue. Now, maybe they just didn't know if there were others, but I would think that going back to this precedent of what happened in Ferrara, that if it wasn't Rossi's music, Modena would have been aware of it and would not have written something new or an innovation, shall we say.
It's an interesting question. What does he mean by hadash? Was it the music itself? Was the fact that it was published? Was it the fact that it was published with his concoction of the music going one way and the Hebrew awkwardly following it?
Yeah.
That as you and I have, I think, both noticed, Reuchlin set up Reuchlin, who is a major figure in Hebrew and Jewish Kabbalah at the beginning of the 16th century.
Right. Just to clarify, he is a Christian Hebraist, part of the humanism of that time that wanted to not just accept the official Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, but they wanted to read for themselves what the original had. And so they consulted rabbis and other Jewish scholars to teach them Hebrew so that they could do this. And then in the course of this, they came across the cantillation symbols, the ta'amim. So Reuchlin and some of his predecessors asked them to sing. And so we have this very unusual notation of at least the German way, or one German way of chanting the Torah that was written down in staff notation. Just for those who didn't know who Reuchlin was, I thought I would interject that.
But one further point about Reuchlin is that he was one, I would almost say, among hundreds of Christian Hebraists who wrote grammars of the introductions to the Hebrew language, both in terms of grammar and syntax and the vowels and the cantillation markings. And so the question is, on this spectrum, at what point do we move from cantillation to art music? And at what point can we say new? And maybe we should say a few words about what happened in Ferrara. But Modena had a 3-year stint teaching and being a rabbi in Ferrara because in Venice, the rabbis and the government kept raising the age of ordination. So if he wanted to do a rabbi thing, he had to leave town. As part of his activities there, he set up an event involving choral music in the synagogue. This event is described in at least 2 sources, and it created quite a stir where some people became very enthusiastic and other people very hostile. The question is, what exactly was done at that event and what offended people? In particular, was choral music in and of itself offensive in the synagogue? Or was it the appearance of perhaps musical instruments that were part of the presentation at the event? Because the event took place on Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, those are both Chagim. And Morosini's description, who was a student of Leon Modena's, who after Modena died, converted and wrote an extensive description of Jewish life in Italy at the time and regularly referred back to Modena, said there was even an organ in the presentation. Could there have been other instruments, woodwinds, brass, strings? Let me tell the joke that I told at the Rossi conference 20 years ago in Israel. I started off with this joke and nobody laughed. This Jewish tourist group is being taken on a tour through an old synagogue, say in Prague, and they're shown the organ. and they are in absolute shock. How can you have an organ in a synagogue? And the tour guide says, oh, we never play it. It's just to keep certain types of people away. And what's interesting is that certain types of people, in Modena's defense of art music, he refers to his opponents as mitchasadim, those who are pseudo-pious, who are pretentiously pious, and there seems to be this valence to music that has taken on a disproportionate amount of it's a wedge issue in Jewish life at this time.
Now, in the preface to Hashirim, Modena defends many practices, but he does not mention instrumental music. In fact, he seems to go out of his way to say it's understandable that instrumental music was banned, but no one ever thought of banning vocal music to praise God in the synagogue. It is clear that Maimonides intended that instrumental music is completely prohibited, while vocal music, although we can be more lenient, is still forbidden over wine. But now we must look into the matter of intention and occasion. It is certain that vocal music in itself, and not in association with feasting and drinking, is permitted. Which makes me think that instruments were not used, at least in Rossi's performances.
So when we're in Ferrara, after the brouhaha breaks out over the performance, whatever it was, Modena sits down and he writes an extensive responsum on the issue of instrumental music. Mm-hmm. And then he goes about and gets the endorsement of the leading rabbis in Venice. Mm-hmm. So that he has really staked out the issues involved in music. And this responsum that he wrote is published in de Rossi's Hashirim Asher LeShlomo. So in this, at the beginning, he is emphatic about instrumental music, but as he goes along, I think instrumental music creeps in there. And he is not as hostile, not as emphatic as he was at the beginning in terms of instrumental music. And certainly in the descriptions of Morosini and of his own discussion of his academy, there's discussion of instrumental music. Mm-hmm. So that, again, there's this spectrum of moving from cantorial music to a bunch of cantors and assistant cantors singing together. Mm-hmm. To what extent are they singing in harmony? To what extent are they singing in counterpoint? To what extent are they singing art music? To what extent do they have instruments? It's an interesting venture.
Subjective, as you say. Can we assume, as I think everyone does, that there were no women singing in these choirs? It seems to be exclusively men with one singer on each part. Was the Jewish community segregated by sex as they are generally in Orthodox communities?
There are a couple of traces of women's involvement. De Rossi's sister, mm-hmm. Madame Europa, who certainly was a singer. And in the historical literature, when it discusses her, it discusses a long list of women singers who made their appearances in Jewish communities in Europe. Were they singing with the men? Don't know. The other one who appears in the literature is the wife of a famous rabbi who wrote on Yehudit Traboti, or is it Taraboti? She was engaged in music, and I think Taraboti, in one of his discussions of music, refers to his wife. Now, whether this was going on in the synagogue or not, my sense would probably be that they weren't. The women's galleries in Italian synagogues were pretty much sealed off. There was even some response about whether wood would do, or they had to have metal bars covering them. But it seems at some point there is some mixing. Certainly on Simchat Torah, the synagogues were kept open all night. The women came in and kissed and danced with the Torahs. So there is certain liminal spaces where there's some mixing. Just as the ghetto was porous, so was the mechitza.
Although, in churches, certainly, the women would not be singing. It would just be the men. So if this music was done in imitation of what was going on in the other religion, then one would think it's just men. But as you say, we don't have any proof one way or the other.
That's an interesting word, imitation. And this becomes another hot button word in the literature, imitation, because imitation of non-Jews is a no-no. Right. So what Jewish musicians did is they worked out, this goes back to Emmanuel of Rome, who was in the 1300s, I believe, a poet, an intellectual figure in the Roman Jewish community. Basically, the idea is that Jews originally had the idea of music, right. And it was the non-Jews who stole it from the Jews. And then, because of the perils of the diaspora, Jews could no longer engage in it. And now all they're doing is they're borrowing it back from the people who held it for them. Right. This is a model in Jewish historiography that has appeared. This is Gerson Schollem's gambit on Kabbalah. Nothing was ever borrowed from non-Jews. They held it for us, and we're just getting it back.
What will the science of music say to the Christians? I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. We've known that the science of music was totally present in our art, and excelling in its knowledge were the Levite musicians, Asaph, Heman, and Yedutun, as well as King David and King Solomon and many other prophets. But today, none of us have skills in this area. Nothing. Davar shel kalum. Let's go back, though, to Leon Modena. He was a prodigy, right? A child prodigy. Don't we have this poem that he wrote when he was a young teenager? Or was he 12 years old or something? That it's macaronic. It reads the same way in Hebrew and Italian.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not a translation. It's saying the same ideas, which is a dirge on the death of his beloved teacher.
With the same phonetic sounds. With
the same phonetic sounds and the same ideas. Mm-hmm. And he republishes it a couple of times during his lifetime. And what his argument is that it shows the ability of Hebrew and Italian to capture the same kind of ideas. It's an attempt to present Hebrew in a universalistic spirit, that Italian can speak Hebrew and Hebrew can speak Italian.
Mm-hmm.
He did all kinds of inventive, playful in the intellectual sense, involving Hebrew, involving word plays, involving Hebrew and Italian.
He had an addiction also, right? He was addicted to gambling and lost a lot of money in that. Was that was that unusual for Jews at that time, for rabbis at that time?
I don't think it was that unusual. Um, Also, I'm not sure if the image of the rabbi was the same as it is today, where you have a congregational rabbi who is supposed to be a moral exemplar for the community, many of whom are not. But it basically seems that most of the intellectuals in the Jewish community were rabbis. Um, so gambling was common in Venice. It was common among Jews. But don't forget, we're talking about the Venice as being a gambling center, the Lido, with casinos. Also, his autobiography, as I mentioned earlier, he describes his downs more than his ups. And if you look at his cash flow, it seems that he's often able to recoup. Um, but I would not say that this is necessarily a moral scar on his reputation as people might want to make it seem to be.
But doesn't he write about this himself as he tries to stop, but he can't stop gambling?
Yeah, it's clearly an obsession. Um, he wrote a pamphlet also at a very young age about gambling, where two characters debate the virtues and deficits of gambling. Um, the literature usually talks about him having written a young anti-gambling pamphlet, but if you follow the arguments in the pamphlet, I'd say the pro-gambling arguments are stronger. One of my favorites is, he says, look at people that invest in ships. Look how easy it is for a ship to go down. Look at people who invest in the market. Look how easy it is for the market to go down. Isn't that what gambling is?
Then there's the alchemy, his attempt to turn base metals into gold. From our perspective of today, it seems just very crude and medieval and not Jewish, but apparently that's wrong.
There's, I would say that there's a lot that could be said about Jewish alchemy. That I think there's this attempt, again, probably going back to the 19th century, of dividing the world in a binary fashion between rational and irrational, between scientific and superstitious.
Mhm.
I think in the 17th century, um, the categories are much more blurred. And I don't think that they thought of them as as unreasonable as we do. So I think that there is this attempt to diminish, because we know so much about him, that we some it might be TMI, in terms of too much information. Um, God knows what other people in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, in the modern period have conjectured in their heads that they didn't leave a paper trail. I think that there's an awful lot of information about Jewish musicians. Um, I don't think that he's unique. I think that he though left an incredible trail of music. He wrote many poems. You know, there was the macaronic that read in both languages. He had all kinds of other poems with other kinds of literary feats to them, and an echo poem where the that every line, every hemistick ended, and then the next one began with the echo of the end of the last one. Um, there were at events at Siumim, when the community finished a Talmudic tractate, there would be a Sium, and he would prepare poetry for it. He would print it up, hand it out as a song sheet, and people would sing it.
So
That
many of his poems could have been song lyrics, you're saying?
could have been song lyrics, and
Mm.
in the various writings he talks about, I wrote this song and my son sang it at such and such an event.
Mhm, mhm.
um, so it's, I think that the art music that Rossi gets credit for is not to be diminished um, by saying that there was other activity going on, but can be enhanced by saying that it's a salient form of an aspect of Jewish life and culture that has often not only been overlooked, but people have turned away from it because there's this idea that Jews aren't supposed to do music. And I think the same thing can be said for the plastic arts. There's this lack of attention to Jewish artistic creativity,
Mhm.
because people get this notion that it can't be done, when it was done throughout history.
Apparently, Rossi himself was part of a Jewish musical theater troupe that traveled around to various communities. But the only record we have of that is word that it existed. So there's certainly, as you say, a lot of music that did not leave a concrete paper trail of itself.
Yes. And I think that one of the difficulties of writing history is the amount of material that's not there.
Right.
And that's why I get allergic when I hear people talk about the first,
Yeah.
or I hear people talk about normative, that there's all kinds of stuff happening among Jews that doesn't fit a simple categorization.
So just one more thing. After Rossi dies, presumably sometime around 1628, 1630, when there's 1630, there's no more sign of him. And I think Modena even writes that he has died. There seems to be a dearth of, let me put it conservatively, a dearth of evidence of further activity such as Rossi's. It pops up occasionally, Casale Monferrato, etc. But there doesn't seem to be certainly any collection like Rossi's of 33. Did it just die out, this desire to participate in the late Renaissance in terms of music within the Jewish community, or?
There is this other manuscript that's in the library of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati.
The Kadosh, the Kedusha?
Yeah, the Birnbaum I think it's called the Birnbaum manuscript. That's a collection of art music that's often compared to Rossi. There's been attempts to compare it with him, to argue that he was the author, that it preceded him, that it followed him. Whatever conclusions can't be made, I think that there's another example of a art music manuscript that has been located. And I suspect that there are probably more to be found. And even if the manuscripts aren't found, there is the likelihood of more literary references to the music. My sense is that there will be more traces found. Sadly, Don Haran died. He was one of the major pioneers, certainly in research on Rossi, but I think also in leaving no stone unturned in looking for early modern Jewish music.
Such as Israel Adler had
Adler had done, who was Haran's teacher, and Idelson and Eric Werner.
But the fact that Rossi's music was virtually unknown for 2 centuries until it was rediscovered, helped by Naumburg in Paris, shows that maybe there are other even publications that were that period that just haven't come to light yet, as you're saying.
And I think that one of the interesting aspects of history is the microscopic look of the transmission of the culture, and not just the cultural product itself. So the afterlife of Rossi may be as interesting as the actual product itself. In fact, there was Teudat Shlomo, which was an early work by a cantor in Europe that I think might have had some of this music in it. But I think that a scavenger hunt would be in line.
Cool. Howie, this has been so enjoyable. I've been having so much fun with this
as I have too.
Conversation. Thank you so much. I have learned so much and just enjoyed passing these facts back and forth with you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you.